Chapter 6. The Church's Cure. More Dancing. By late August, Strasbourg's leaders faced a grim, almost surreal decision. The dancers were multiplying. Their ranks swelled with each passing day, spreading through every street and square. Exhaustion, blood, and fear had become the city's new order. And then the unthinkable happened. The Church, in consultation with physicians, proposed a solution so paradoxical it seemed insane: encourage the dancing to continue. The reasoning was chillingly simple. If the afflicted could dance themselves clean of the plague, sweat out the imbalance of their humors, perhaps life could continue. Streets were cleared, boards were laid down, and musicians were brought in. The city's ritual of madness became a sanctioned communal spectacle. Priests blessed the dancers with fervent chants, invoking saints and angels to protect their souls even as their bodies tore themselves apart. The faithful watched with terror and hope intertwined. Could salvation really come through this torment? Could motion itself become a cure? But the results were not comforting. The dancers spun faster, their limbs jerking with fevered intensity. Feet swelled and blistered, hands clawed at the air, scratching, trembling. Some collapsed only to rise again, as if drawn by a force beyond human comprehension. Even the clergy began to whisper in fear. "Is this divine mercy or divine punishment?" they asked one another in hushed tones. The streets became both sanctuary and battlefield. Families watched as loved ones danced themselves toward death, their bodies writhing, their eyes wide with unending panic. Priests blessed each step. Physicians measured pulses and murmured remedies. The city collectively held its breath, caught between horror and hope. No one spoke of the underlying terror that the human body, once a vessel of reason and labor, had become a machine for suffering, a slave to invisible forces, and perhaps to the collective despair of the city itself. Yet Strasbourg continued to dance. Weeks passed. The city's rhythm became a haunting, almost musical pulse, a macabre heartbeat echoing through alleyways and squares. Townspeople spoke of watching for hours from shuttered windows, mesmerized by the relentless spectacle. Some whispered of possession. Others claimed the plague was a warning, a dark mirror reflecting the city's sin and suffering. In the heart of it all, the dancers moved on, oblivious to prayer, medicine, or reason. Their agony became performance, their suffering spectacle. The Church's cure had only amplified the horror, a terrifying testament to the fragile boundary between human will and human despair. Strasbourg had surrendered to the rhythm of the plague. The city itself had become a stage, and every citizen, whether dancing, watching, or praying, was trapped in the nightmare of motion. Chapter 7. Collapse and Death. As September dawned over Strasbourg, the city had become a theater of suffering unlike any in memory. The fevered dance showed no mercy. Feet raw, bodies broken, and spirits fraying, the dancers pressed onward, driven by forces no one could name. Collapse became routine. Witnesses described convulsions that twisted the limbs into impossible angles. The exhausted fell face first into the streets, yet many rose again, as if compelled by some invisible rhythm. The city watched in silent horror, unable to intervene. Deaths were inevitable. Chroniclers of the plague reported dozens succumbing to sheer exhaustion, heart failure, or stroke. Others succumbed to secondary infections, their bodies weakened by constant movement and bleeding feet. Families wept in private courtyards, shielding their eyes from the grotesque spectacle outside. The plague seemed almost selective, claiming the frail and strong alike. A merchant who had laughed at the first dancers now writhed with delirium in the main square. A young bride, barely married, collapsed mid-step, her screams echoing against timbered walls. Children watched their parents contort in agony, unable to comprehend the unnatural forces at work. Physicians tried to intervene, but found themselves powerless. Their powders and potions had no effect. Priests invoked divine mercy, yet prayers dissolved into the oppressive rhythm of the city's madness. Even the most pious began to fear that God had abandoned them, leaving only the relentless beat of human suffering. Some townspeople claimed to see ghostly figures moving among the dancers, shadows of the dead drawn back into the dance by unseen hands. Others whispered of demons riding the afflicted, urging them onward. Whether legend or reality, the fear only intensified. Strasbourg became a city suspended between life and death. The streets, once orderly and vibrant, now pulsed with agony. The rhythm of the plague had become the city's heartbeat, a heartbeat that carried both life and death, hope and despair. By the end of September, the dancing slowed. Exhaustion claimed the bodies first, and then, slowly, the spirit. Yet the memory of movement lingered in the air. Footprints stained with blood remained etched into the cobblestones. The cries and groans of the afflicted echoed in the minds of survivors long after the streets fell silent. Strasbourg had survived, but it was forever changed. The plague had left scars not only on its people, but on its very soul. And still, centuries later, historians would puzzle over the mystery. Why had the city danced? What invisible force had driven so many to spin, to tremble, to defy death itself? Strasbourg had witnessed the ultimate surrender of body to despair, and the city would never forget the sound of its own heartbeat, the rhythm of the dancing plague.
Chapter 8. The Silence After the Song. When the last dancer fell, silence descended on Strasbourg like a shroud. The city, which had pulsed for weeks with the fevered rhythm of bodies in torment, now lay still, as though holding its breath in collective mourning. Streets, once alive with the haunting spectacle of movement, were empty. The cobblestones bore the stains of exhaustion and blood. The smell of sweat, iron, and fear lingered, a reminder of the nightmare that had gripped the city. Windows remained shuttered, doors bolted. Families peered cautiously into the streets, uncertain whether the plague had truly ended or merely rested, biding its time. Chroniclers of the era wrote with a mixture of awe and horror. They described streets littered with discarded shoes, with garments clinging to fallen bodies, with the remnants of a city transformed into a grotesque stage of suffering. Physicians catalogued the dead and dying, the weary and the traumatized, yet could offer no explanation for the cause, nor any insight into the mechanics of the contagion. The Church, whose prayers and blessings had accompanied the entire ordeal, proclaimed the end of God's trial. Yet the faith of Strasbourg had been shaken more profoundly than any sermon could repair. For many, the plague had exposed the fragility of reason, the limits of medicine, and the tenuousness of divine protection.
Survivors returned to their homes, carrying with them memories of convulsing neighbors, of children spinning with vacant eyes, of relatives who had danced themselves into death. Some could not sleep, some could not eat. In quiet corners, the city's people whispered stories of the plague for months, decades even, warning the next generation of the invisible force that had once seized Strasbourg. The silence was oppressive. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind down the alley reminded the citizens of the rhythm they had endured, the beat of terror that had dominated their lives. And yet, in that silence, there was also relief. The plague had ended. The city had survived. But Strasbourg had learned something dark and haunting, that despair could manifest in the flesh, that collective fear and grief could animate bodies in ways neither reason nor faith could control. The dancing had been more than a plague. It had been a revelation, a reminder of the power of the human body, the human mind, and the human spirit, when pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The streets would heal, the buildings would be repaired, and life would continue. But the echo of the dancers, the ghost of their relentless rhythm, would linger forever in the memory of the city. The plague had passed, but the story remained, a haunting testament to the night Strasbourg danced itself to the edge of madness. Chapter 9. The Dance That Never Ended. Though the streets of Strasbourg had returned to quiet, the story of the dance refused to fade. For years, and even centuries later, the city carried the memory of that summer like a shadow, a dark rhythm echoing in the collective consciousness. Scholars debated the cause. Some blamed ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold growing on rye bread. Others claimed mass hysteria, born of famine, disease, and the pressure of a city teetering on the edge of despair. Yet no explanation captured the horror, the eerie compulsion, the haunting intensity of the event. For those who survived, the dance never truly ended. In dreams, they recalled the spinning bodies, the vacant eyes, the relentless beat that had consumed the city. Children awoke crying from visions of neighbors moving as though possessed. Parents trembled at the thought that the plague might return. Even the clergy admitted to nights haunted by the cries and laughter of the dancers. The city's memory was more than just fear. It was a warning. Human suffering, when left unchecked, could manifest in the most unimaginable ways. Collective grief and panic had given life to movement itself, a haunting spectacle no medicine, prayer, or authority could suppress. Historians later noted that the dancing of 1518 was unique in its intensity and duration. Other dancing plagues appeared sporadically across Europe in different centuries, but Strasbourg had endured the most extreme manifestation. Hundreds convulsing for weeks, bodies breaking under the strain, communities paralyzed by fear. Some survivors believed that the city had been cursed, that the rhythm lingered in the cobblestones, the walls, the very air, waiting, perhaps, for the next summer of madness. And in that haunting thought lay the truth. The dance had never truly ended. It existed in memory, in shadow, in the whispered stories of those who survived. It lived in the trembling of hands, the restless shifting of feet, the quiet unease that followed the citizens long after the streets had emptied. The plague had passed, but Strasbourg had learned that certain forces, grief, fear, despair, cannot be contained. They move through bodies, through streets, through generations. And sometimes they dance. The city had survived the summer of 1518, but the summer had survived the city. Chapter 10. Epilogue. The dance that never died. Centuries have passed since the summer of 1518, yet the story of Strasbourg's dancing plague refuses to be forgotten. What began with a single woman spinning in a fevered trance became a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human mind and body when confronted with suffering beyond comprehension. Historians, scientists, and psychologists have studied the events endlessly. Some offer explanations grounded in biology, the hallucinogenic effects of ergot, a fungus in the rye bread. Others see it as a case of mass hysteria, a psychological contagion that swept through a city already on the brink of despair. Yet no theory fully captures the horror, the intensity, the sheer human tragedy of those weeks. What we do know is this: the plague was not merely physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and collective. It was the unspoken agony of a city transformed into motion. Bodies became instruments of fear and despair, instruments of grief too profound for words. And perhaps that is the enduring terror of the dancing plague, its lesson that suffering, when left unchecked, can manifest in ways that defy reason. It reminds us that the human body is not just flesh and bone, but also a mirror of our deepest fears, our darkest griefs, and our most uncontrollable impulses. Strasbourg rebuilt, life resumed, markets reopened, churches rang their bells, but the memory remained etched in every cobblestone, every alleyway, every whispered story. Artists, chroniclers, and writers would echo the rhythm of those weeks in their works, capturing the terrifying beauty of bodies in motion, dancing at the edge of reason. And even today, when scholars recount the tale, the words carry a weight, the weight of a city that once danced itself into madness, a city that learned how thin the line is between life and despair. The dancers are long gone, their names mostly forgotten, yet their steps remain alive, immortalized in history, in memory, in cautionary tales of fear and frenzy. The plague ended, but the dance never truly died. It lives on in every heartbeat that races with terror, every body that trembles in grief, and every city that faces suffering too great to contain. In the end, the dancing plague of 1518 was not just a story of Strasbourg. It was a story of humanity, a story of what we endure, what we cannot control, and the dark, haunting rhythm that can emerge when despair finds a voice in the human body. And so, even now, when the wind whispers through the streets of Strasbourg, some swear they can hear it, the echo of 1,000 feet, the ghostly rhythm of a dance that refused to end.